What's up, guys? I'm Chad Barnes, and welcome to the channel. Here, it's all about real car talk, from simple fixes to smart driving tips and keeping your ride in top shape. If that sounds good to you, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button, and make sure you watch all the way through. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Let's get to it.
Are we going to your place or mine? Man, just like that. What makes you think I'm looking for a date? What would a 40-year-old woman be doing at a carburetor show? At a carburetor show? Bearded anecdote, a far-sighted person does not say this will not happen for sure, but tries to be prepared for the wildest scenarios. Although it does not always work out. For example, for a long time a large and well-known chain of auto stores sold domestic synthetic motor oil 5W40 from one popular gas brand for 1,600 rubles at 4 liters, and every 2 to 3 months made promotions on it with a sale at 1,300 rubles per canister. I constantly bought this oil exactly on the promo, believing that 1,600 for domestic synthetics is overkill. However, today this oil costs already 2,700 for the same canister, and I bite my elbows that I did not buy it in stock at 1,600. And this is only one of hundreds of examples of price stories with goods for repair and maintenance of the car, which now faces every motorist. So, the recent predictions about carburetor resurrection can, of course, be taken as a joke, but at least theoretically prepare for such a scenario. It is not harmful. And why did carburetors disappear? To begin with, let's remember why carburetors are a thing of the past. After all, the last carb cars came off the domestic assembly lines not so long ago. Indeed, not so long ago. In 2006, in our country, the environmental requirements for cars according to the -2 Euro standard came into effect. These requirements became a decisive barrier for the release and initial registration of new carbureted cars, because the limit for the carbureted power system remained -1 Euro. And it could be ensured not with our simple Ozons and Solexes, but only with very complex electronically controlled carburetors, with many auxiliary systems, including a catalyst. The introduction of the standard in our country happened with a significant delay. In Europe, -2 Euro started working as early as 1992. But in general it could not be called neither a catastrophe nor something excessive, as our automotive industry by 2006 had already fully mastered distributed injection. In the period of 2005 to 2006, the carburetor classics at VAZ and Volga 3110 family were switched to injection. IZH 2126 left the market. Also for this reason, the Little Oka left, because CAZ failed to organize stable mass assembly of cars with Chinese 3-cylinder injector engine. But in general, the losses for the domestic car market and automobile production were limited to this photo autotap. However, it should be noted that even without legislative barriers, the carburetor was already losing ground to the injector, even in our country with a stable demand for super cheap cars. For the increase in the cost of car construction due to injection gave still a lot of attractive advantages for the user. Always stable and simple, without unnecessary movements. Engine start, important for drivers of both sexes, but especially for women. Reduced warm-up time, confident movement even on a cold engine, stable idling speeds with any load, no stalling when starting. Reliable battery charge in traffic jams, the possibility of installing alarm systems with remote start and so on. Can carburetors make a comeback? Theoretically, easily. The production of these units has not been abandoned or ruined. For example, one plant in St. Petersburg still makes a full range of car and truck carburetors. No emergency restoration of technologies and machines is required. And laws, including the basic law of the country, as we can see, are a very flexible thing, capable of adjusting to circumstances and backtracking when necessary. For example, last year, as a temporary measure, automakers were allowed, against the backdrop of a shortage of semiconductors, not to equip cars with the EIA system, which until recently was mandatory, and without which it was forbidden to produce new cars from 2017. Why not allow the temporary release of cars in the budget segment with an outdated environmental standard? Calling it, for example, a social measure of state support for low-income segments of the population in conditions of interruptions in the supply of chips. especially since it is unlikely to have a significant negative impact on the environment if it happens on a relatively limited scale, and lasts for a year or 2 or 3. Removing the injector, putting the carburetor. Technically, it is not a problem to convert a budget car like Lada Granta or Lagos to carburetor power. Of course, you will need an electronic unit, but a very simple one, for which primitive and cheap element base produced by Russian factories is quite enough. As you know, the integral elements of any carburetor engine are driven from the crankshaft mechanical diaphragm gasoline pump and trampola with vacuum and centrifugal ignition advance angle regulators. Well, and in fact, the carburetor itself with an intake manifold. But here is the problem: on relatively modern injector motors there is no landing place for the pump for a long time, and there is no landing place for the trampola. And to remake for this cylinder block and its stuffing, monstrously expensive story. In fact, no serious and expensive changes for the carburetor in the design of the motor additionally do not need to be introduced. It is enough to make a few new parts of low technological level and throw out a few of the former. From the engine are thrown out ECU control unit catalysts and oxygen sensors, electronic throttle, electronic gas pedal intake manifold for distributed injection injectors, high pressure gasoline pump in the tank, gasoline vapor recovery system, adsorber, remain unchanged, crankshaft position sensor and its toothed pulley, absolute pressure sensor, DAD, ignition coils, distributed or monoblock. It doesn't matter, new ones are made and installed, intake manifold for carburetor, low pressure electric gasoline pump exhaust manifold, spider, without catalyst filler, electronic control unit for ignition coil switching and ignition advance. Now let's figure out how to put it all together. As the old saying of car mechanics says, to start and work the engine, it is necessary to supply fuel, spark, and all this, strictly at the right time and in the right amount. For fuel supply in our conditionally remodeled from injector to carburetor motor is entirely responsible self-sufficient carburetor, which must be installed on a new intake manifold, hardly the most complex new part in this whole story, but not complicated in itself. The only serious requirement for the manifold is height, so that the hood with the carburetor will close. The carburetor works in tandem with the simplest membrane electromechanical low-pressure pump. Such pumps from one Chinese site on old Jiggly have long been put by homebuilders instead of standard mechanical pumps driven from the crankshaft. The electric pump works no worse, but due to the remote installation is not overheated from the engine and is not prone to the formation of vapor plugs even in the strongest heat. With ignition everything is a little wiser, but not too much. Mechanical trembler in a carburetor engine performs two important tasks: distribution of spark to the cylinders at strictly defined moments, as well as correction of this moment depending on the load and crankshaft speed, thanks to the centrifugal and vacuum revolutions regulator. But we, as we remember, have nowhere to screw the trampola on the former injector motor. Therefore, its role will be performed by the simplest electronic unit, which receives information about the position of the pistons from the crankshaft sensor. We already have it, and on its basis switches for ignition coils, separate or united in a common housing, does not matter. The same unit makes the correction of the ignition advance angle by revolutions from the same crankshaft sensor and by load from the absolute pressure sensor in the intake manifold. The control module must work according to a very simple and rigid algorithm, radically simpler than flexible and intricate injector firmware. Such a primitive ECU Russian car industry will have to create from scratch, but it is very simple, many times simpler than the ECU injector motor, cheap and can be assembled on elements produced by domestic factories without the help of Taiwanese TSMC and other Asian chipmakers, which has shunned us by sanctions. Actually, all that is left is to put an empty exhaust manifold, the same, but without platinum ceramics of the catalytic converter. Pull out the choke, and you can turn the starter to start. Peculiarities of owning a modern car with a carburetor. Actually, we are hardly going to open some America here, but it is still necessary to tell, because years go by and there are a lot of drivers on the roads now who had the first injector car and the era of carburetors did not catch at all. Therefore, things that are commonplace for car owners of 80-90s and earlier years are a wonder for them. Let's voice the most common potential misconceptions and questions and comment on them. The carburetor is unreliable and requires constant dancing with a tambourine, endless adjustment of idle, float with a needle, etc. Of course, a carburetor is not as trouble-free as an injector injection, which you can joke about not getting into for years without any damage. However, the real difference in operation between them is not so terrible. Simply in our country, the reputation of carburetors spoiled several generations of car owners with a very low technical culture, as well as the initially low quality of carbs and a large number of defective parts. As a result, the carburetor has gained the dubious fame of a design that requires cunning and habit. 10 identical cars with the same carburetor motors started differently and behaved differently in different modes. One required starting on half pressure and the other only with the gas pedal. One pulled steadily almost on cold and the other needed to warm up the engine almost to 90 degrees. One new Jaguar worked flawlessly for years and the one bought right after or before it could facacat the owner's brain for years on end. And so on and so forth. Starting carburetor engines pissed off half of men and disgusted 9 out of 10 women from driving. It's a fact, alas. However, the reason is solely due to the fact that carburetors were erroneously subject to the rule, the unit works, don't get into it. Alas, it did not work with this device. The carburetor had to be preventively monitored to keep the few and quite simple adjustments intact to keep the elastic parts, membranes, rubber and cardboard seals intact and to keep the inside clean by periodic disassembly and thorough blowing. In this case, it worked clearly, stably and was started universally without adjustments for the individual characteristics of each car. Starting a serviceable debugged cold carburetor engine is very simple and does not require getting used to a particular instance. The suction is pulled out strictly to the stop without any intermediate positions and the gas pedal, as well as on the injector, do not need to touch. After that, the car starts with a half turn and the driver only needs to gradually remove the suction, looking at the tachometer, and keeping the revolutions at the warm-up 1.5 to 2,000 revolutions. Carburetor maintenance is a complicated and expensive process, similar in genre to the repair and maintenance of clockwork mechanisms. When a carburetor is an exotic, servicing it really becomes an exclusive. Rare masters charge a lot because they fully realize the rarity of their competence. When the carburetor was a mass device, there were plenty of such masters and any car owner could easily master the complete disassembly of the carb to the screw, adjustment and diagnostics because popular and reasonably written brochures were produced and sold. There was also a very stable infrastructure of carburetor exchange, for example, the Moscow carburetor plant, for any makes and models of domestic cars as well as many large taxi fleets in big cities, mainly for Volgas, were engaged in it on a large scale. Having a large exchange fund of carburetors, specialized masters, without coming to consciousness, carried out their complete reassembly, with replacement of all consumables and adjustment, and for 10 minutes changed your carburetor on the car, receiving a small amount of money and taking your carb in return. The system worked stably, with a guarantee for the work performed due to the experience of the masters and the mass phenomenon. Many car owners systematically used this service, changing carburetors at a certain interval from a year to 3, and not knowing any problems with them in the end. The carburetor is unreliable, any speck of fuel or air can clog the jets and stop the car. This is one of the widespread myths generated by the notoriously low culture of car maintenance and operation in our country, although there is some truth in it. The passage holes in the finest carburetor jets are many times larger than those in injector nozzles, but the latter are not at all prone to clogging problems. With quality air and fuel filters, no debris from the outside of the carburetor do not penetrate, although they are able to form inside. Falling flakes of sediment from fuel, moisture and gasoline, as well as corrosion products of the carburetor housings can clog them, although the process of clogging is not quick and generally predictable. And with the above-mentioned timely preventive disassembly, flushing and purging problems with carburetor do not occur much more often than with injector. A carburetor car is dumber than an injector car, its dynamics is worse. Oddly enough, not at all. Or even vice versa. If we compare two simple in design, serviceable atmospheric gasoline engines like the same Granta engine with injector and carburetor, the latter will be even more vigorous on dynamic modes of acceleration and uniform movement with high speed at open chambers. Carburetor allows to receive from the engine At least not less power than that which is given by distributed injection. Plus it is not hindered by a catalytic converter and it is not slowed down by a thoughtful electronic gas pedal. A carbureted car consumes more fuel than an injector car under the same conditions and modes. Yes and no. In most engine operating modes, a serviceable and well-tuned carburetor has almost parity with an injector if we speak again about identical atmospheric engines. Nevertheless, the total consumption of a carburetor is likely to be higher, though not radically, of course. Firstly, due to warm-ups, especially long ones in winter. Carburetor for ideal work without jerks and failures needs, in a good way, to gain half of the working temperature of the engine and even more, while the injector is able to go steadily, if necessary, and completely cold, well, and at 25 degrees and in the order of things. Secondly, the carburetor requires increased idling speeds in comparison with the injector, which in the prevailing traffic jam mode of operation also gradually accumulates fuel overconsumption. The carburetor is unecological, the car with it poisons the nature and emits stench. Of course, a commonplace and mass-produced carburetor has a limit of environmental friendliness, above which it cannot jump without a sharp complication of the design, which can make it more expensive than any injector. However, the stench is greatly exaggerated even in the simplest variant. There are more myths than truth. And if you really want to, you can even bring a car with a carburetor engine to -€1 eco class if you install a catalytic converter. However, it will not be possible to take an ordinary catalytic converter from a modern budget injector car for this purpose. Neither new nor second-hand. For the catalytic converter here is needed exactly designed for -€1, simple oxidizing, not working with nitrogen oxides, because they were not standardized for -€1. Modern catalytic converter of 3-layer construction, oxidation reduction oxidation, capable of eliminating nitrogen oxide, requires fundamentally higher accuracy in the preparation of fuel mixture plus oxygen sensor, together with which could work only the most complex and very expensive electronically controlled carburetors under the sunset of the carburetor era. Largely due to their higher price than the injector injection and low reliability, such carburetors did not spread and died before they were born. How will air conditioning or electric power steering work on a carbureted engine? After all, such options give a big load on the engine, at which the idle speed drops down a lot. The first variant of the answer to this question, no way. For if we seriously consider even a temporary hypothetical permission to return to carburetors, it is obviously logical to allow it. For the most basic equipment of personal and light commercial cars, for which even the conditioner is an excessive luxury. The same applies to EPS. Instead of it will be quite workable simple steering rack without an amplifier, the absence of which will compensate the increased gear ratio. For it is not to fad. The second option will work, but badly. That is, idle speeds of the engine will become quite noticeably drop down at inclusion of air conditioner or steering on parking. And the driver will have to raise them by suction up to 1100 to 1200 to keep them within the permissible limits of 800 to 900 under load. This is a manual option, inconvenient, fraught with quick contamination of plugs from working on over-enriched mixture and risk of sudden stalling. The third option, it will work well, but only with the help of an additional system, which increases the cost of the whole idea. On carburetor cars with standard air conditioner, as a rule, there is an additional vacuum line, frog, actuator and electro valve connected with the button of Conde switching on. When the generator of coolness is switched on, the electro valve opens the way of vacuum and the stem of the frog pulls up the throttle cable slightly, adding revolutions to the engine. But it is again an unnecessary luxury in our story, discrediting the idea of creating a steampunk granta. Is it possible to install an auto-start alarm system on a carbureted car? It is possible, but you should not do it. On sale there are produced in small series of systems, auto pump, including those controlled remotely, precisely in the expectation of working with alarm systems with remote start. They look like some modules attached to the carburetor and connected by their working levers with the cable of the air damper. But such systems do not function too stable and are prone to rapid dysregulation. Cases of their long and stable operation without intervention are extremely rare. In conclusion, while converting a modern car to a carburetor system is technically possible, it presents significant challenges and may not be practical for most drivers. The complexities of modern engine management systems, emissions regulations, and fuel efficiency standards make such a conversion a daunting task. However, for enthusiasts willing to invest time and resources, understanding the intricacies of carburetor maintenance can lead to a rewarding experience. Regular upkeep, tuning, and proper adjustments are essential to ensure optimal performance. Ultimately, whether you choose to embrace the nostalgia of a carbureted engine or stick with modern fuel injection, it's important to weigh the pros and cons carefully. Thank you for watching, and we hope this video has provided valuable insights into the world of carburetors.